My name's Amanda. I'm 32, and everything I believed about loyalty, blood, and belonging collapsed during a retirement event I'll never forget. The evening air was thick with expensive perfume and polished egos. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections across the ballroom, where my father, Richard Harrington, stood at the center, a champagne flute glinting in his hand like a trophy. He smiled, tight, smug, and declared, "My real children are the ones who've brought honor to this family." Applause broke out instantly. Laughter. Smiles. Then, silence, his gaze locked onto mine across the crowded room. "Cold. Calculated, you. Can go now," he said, his voice slicing through conversation like a blade. Loud. Deliberate. Designed to humiliate. My heart pounded. Legs numb, hands trembling, I rose slowly from my chair. A tidal wave of shame surged through my chest. But, just as I reached for my purse, something unexpected happened. My husband, Scott, stood beside me. No hesitation. No fear. That one decision would change everything I knew about partnership, resilience, and justice. Before I reveal what unfolded after that moment, take a second to comment where you're tuning in from and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because what comes next? You won't see it coming. Let's rewind. I was raised in a manicured New England neighborhood just outside Boston, a community where accomplishments weren't praised. They were presumed. Our house, a pristine colonial with navy shutters and a white picket fence, gave off the illusion of comfort. But inside? The atmosphere crackled with pressure and perfectionism. My father, Richard, wasn't simply a senior executive in private banking. He was a man who tallied worth through accolades, not affection. His attention was transactional, and his disapproval was a storm cloud that hovered constantly. My mother, Elaine, was elegant, gentle, and completely eclipsed by her husband's overbearing nature. She'd offer fleeting words of solace behind closed doors, but never once challenged his authority. I lost her when I was 20, breast cancer taking not just her life, but the only buffer I had between relentless judgment and fragile self-esteem. My brother Jason? The eldest, the heir apparent. Ivy League educated, following dad into finance without ever questioning the blueprint. My sister Kimberly? Brilliant, precise, a heart surgeon with a trophy case full of medical honors. They were the legacy carriers. The mirror images of who my father wished I'd been. Then there was me. Even as a child, I gravitated toward pages, not profit. Stories were my refuge. I'd retreat into novels when reality became too jagged to endure. I remember one incident vividly, my 12th birthday recital. Our glossy black grand piano gleamed in the living room. I was halfway through Debussy's Clair de Lune when my hand slipped, just one note out of place. My father straightened his posture, adjusted his tie, and walked out. No words. Just the sound of the front door closing behind him. I finished the piece with tears clouding my vision, but I finished it. That memory burned itself into my bones, perfection or exile. No middle ground. College brought a brief taste of freedom. I got accepted to Amherst to study English literature. My father scoffed. "You're throwing your future into a bonfire of fantasies," he said. When I asked for tuition help, he dismissed me outright. I scraped together scholarships, took campus jobs, and made it work on my own. Still, every personal win felt dulled by that internalized voice asking, "Is this good enough?" Romantic relationships were complicated. I'd either chase emotionally distant men who mirrored my father's cold standards, or sabotage anything real before vulnerability could expose my flaws. But 3 years ago, all of that shifted. It happened in a quiet bookshop in Cambridge. I was searching the classics aisle when my fingers brushed against another hand reaching for the same rare edition of Jane Eyre. I looked up, and met eyes that didn't judge. Just warmth. Scott Taylor. His smile wasn't rehearsed. It was kind. Disarming. "You should have it," he said, pulling his hand back. "Anyone passionate about Bronte deserves that copy more than I do." We ended up chatting for hours at the cafe next door. Scott was a software engineer who loved old novels, rainy days, and handwritten letters. He didn't interrupt. Didn't. Lecture. When I opened up about wanting to launch an independent publishing imprint for marginalized authors, he didn't scoff. He leaned in. He asked about distribution plans. Genre focuses. Financial projections. 6 months later, Lighthouse Press was born, because of his support and my determination. We started modestly, releasing 2 titles in our inaugural year. By year 2, one of our novels had won regional recognition, and our roster expanded to 6 titles annually. It wasn't a financial windfall, but it was meaningful. That's when I knew I had built something on my own terms. Something real. And when Scott and I exchanged vows at the Boston Public Library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and people who valued who I truly was, it felt like coming home for the first time, but as I'd learned soon enough, my past hadn't finished writing its chapters. My father skipped the ceremony. Claimed urgent meetings in Chicago, as if a last-minute transaction outweighed witnessing his daughter say, "I do." Jason didn't bother showing up either. He mailed a sleek, impersonal gift that screamed assistant picked. Only Kimberly attended, staying just long enough to be seen before jetting off for a conference. 1 hour. That's all they gave me. You're too good for them, Scott whispered as we swayed during our first dance. Surrounded by genuine warmth, his parents, lifelong friends, laughter that reached the eyes, I felt the ache of absence louder than any music. 2 years passed. I hadn't spoken more than a sentence to my father. That's when the invitation landed, thick cardstock, embossed lettering, smug tone practically oozing off the paper. Richard Harrington, Executive Vice President of First Atlantic Bank, was stepping down after 4 decades. There would be an exclusive dinner at the Hawthorne, Boston's crown jewel of elite dining. Scott caught my expression as I held the envelope. My hands trembled. "We don't need to attend," he said gently. "Maybe," I began, struggling even to voice it. Maybe this is his way of reaching out. But even as the words left my lips, they tasted like denial. Hope where there should have been caution. Maybe retirement softened him. Maybe not. The evening arrived faster than I'd prepared for. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror in a tailored navy gown, more than I'd usually spend, but I wanted armor. Professional makeup hid the exhaustion from nights spent tossing, haunted by past dismissals. My hair was styled with precision, every curl placed like strategy. "You're stunning," Scott said, nodding his tie beside me. "I think I'm going to be sick," I confessed. Before we could leave, the familiar choke of panic closed in, tight chest, shallow breaths, pins and needles crawling up my spine. Scott didn't panic. He sat with me at the edge of the bed, talking me through it, helping me inhale for 4, hold for 7, release for 8. Over and over. His hand traced slow, grounding circles along my back until my heart stopped racing. "We can skip this. No one would blame you," he said gently. "I need to go," I replied, pressing a tissue to my lipstick-smudged mouth. One more attempt. Just one. In the car, Boston's skyline unfolded around us, glowing under the evening sky. Scott reached for my hand. "Whatever happens tonight, you're not alone. There are people who love you without conditions." I nodded. I wanted to believe that. Truly. But deep down, I still believed love was something to be earned. That approval had to be fought for. And tonight felt like a final audition for something I'd never quite nailed. The Hawthorne loomed ahead, its historic exterior lit with soft golds. A valet in a sharp red blazer opened my door with practiced flair. I stepped out onto cobblestone, each heel click echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. "Breathe," Scott whispered, his palm warm against my back. We were escorted to the private banquet wing. Inside, everything shimmered. Dozens of Boston's wealthiest mingled beneath chandeliers, clinking flutes of Dom Perignon. A quartet performed Vivaldi in the corner, almost drowned by murmured stock tips and deal negotiations. I spotted Jason first. Centered by the bar like a prince on his throne. 36, dressed in a custom suit, gold cufflinks catching the chandelier's gleam. Laughter surrounded him, colleagues hanging on every word. When he noticed us, he offered a tight smile. "Amanda. Didn't think you'd show." He shook Scott's hand quickly, then turned back to his group. "Everyone, this is my little sister. She's into publishing or something." Before I could respond, he launched into bragging about a recent merger. We were forgotten in seconds. Scott leaned close. "Let's move on." Near the hors d'oeuvres, I spotted Kimberly, flawless in crimson, talking animatedly with 2 women. About her massive diamond ring. "Plaza wedding in June," she said. Thomas suggested Tuscany, but I vetoed it. "Humidity ruins photography." She noticed me. "Amanda. You made it." Her eyes scanned my outfit with the precision of a fashion editor. "Navy's always safe." She introduced us to her fiancé, a neurosurgeon with veneers and a voice that screamed Harvard legacy. The conversation was a blur of wedding venues and Swiss medical panels before she excused herself to network with higher-ranking guests. Scott leaned in. "Your brother and sister?" Exactly what I expected. Just then, as I reached for a glass of champagne, fingers brushed my forearm. "Aunt Patricia. My father's only sister. Smelled like expensive rose and disapproval." "Darling Amanda," she said, leaning in for a barely there air kiss. "You look healthy." The pause between those words said more than she ever would. Aunt Patricia had always treated my father's cruelty as discipline, not damage. She never questioned his barbed comments or impossible standards. Instead, she echoed them, polished them, made them seem noble. She leaned in, her breath laced with imported wine. "Make him proud tonight, sweetheart. He needs that. Especially in front of, well, everyone." Before I could respond, she was already fawning over Kimberly's ring, her voice rising in artificial awe. The room was opulence incarnate. Every table gleamed beneath crystal vases overflowing with white roses and pale blue hydrangeas. Trays circulated non-stop, miniature blinis topped with caviar, seared scallops, quiches the size of coins. The bar boasted aged Scotch, Reserve, Bordeaux, and bartenders in tailored black vests. All around me, murmurs floated: investment strategies, private jets, elite boarding academies. It felt like a country club gala disguised as a farewell. Then I spotted him, across the room. Richard Harrington stood surrounded by Boston's financial elite. At 65, he looked every bit the patriarch, silver hair perfectly parted, bespoke suit framing a figure that hadn't softened with age. His laugh rang out at something said by one of the men, his smile relaxed, genuine. It was a side of him I'd only ever watched from a distance. Scott noticed my pause. Want backup? I shook my head. No. I need to do this. Gathering courage, I crossed the polished floor toward the circle of power. My father saw me. Didn't move. Didn't wave. He just continued speaking until I stood there awkwardly, a misplaced ornament in the wrong display. Eventually, during a lull in conversation, he turned slightly. Amanda. You're here. Not joy. Not warmth. Just acknowledgement. Congratulations. I said, offering the carefully wrapped gift Scott and I had picked, a luxury fountain pen, engraved with his initials. He took the bag without even glancing inside. Everyone, this is Amanda, my youngest, he said, his voice casual. She's in publishing. Independent press, I added. One of our authors was just shortlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award. My father's face remained neutral. Amanda always preferred daydreams, books and stories, while her siblings focused on real achievements. Laughter followed, low, polite, dismissive. Jason just closed a $40 million acquisition. He continued. And Kimberly? Engaged to Dr. Whitfield, chief resident at Mass General. His message rang clear: accomplishments worth applause belong to others. I was decorative, not meaningful. I'll let you get back to your guests, I murmured, retreating before moisture could reach my lashes. Pride held me upright, but barely. Scott met me halfway, handing over a fresh glass of wine. Was it awful? I took a long sip. Predictable. The evening unfolded like a play with a familiar script. My father moved from group to group, shaking hands, offering firm smiles, basking in praise from industry giants. I watched him work the room like a seasoned politician. But the warmth he gave others only deepened the chill he reserved for me. When it came time to take our seats, the division became literal. We were assigned a table tucked away near the back, well away from the main cluster where my father, siblings, and banking royalty had gathered. Our companions? Distant cousins I barely remembered and junior employees, who looked just as displeased with their location. Scott introduced himself politely. I'm Amanda's husband. An older woman across from us peered at me curiously. You're Richard's daughter? The one who isn't in medicine or finance? I nodded. I run a publishing house. Oh, how delightful, she replied, with the tone reserved for finger paintings and lemonade stands. Such a charming endeavor. Throughout the courses, artfully plated lamb, handcrafted sorbet, aged Chardonnay, I chewed and swallowed, but nothing registered. Flavor had vanished. Appetite? Gone. Meanwhile, I couldn't look away from the head table. My father beamed at Jason's stories, chuckled at Kimberly's anecdotes, rested his hand on their shoulders with practiced affection. I knew this version of him existed, I just never got access to it. Scott's thumb brushed mine beneath the tablecloth. Quiet solidarity. If not for him, I might have walked out before dessert. Eventually, the room dimmed slightly. Dessert plates were cleared. A microphone stood at the front. Time for the tributes. The CEO spoke first, lauding my father's strategic brilliance, his decisive leadership, his 4-decade contribution to First Atlantic Bank's growth. Next came a longtime colleague who cracked jokes about their early careers and long nights in the office. Then Jason stood, glass in hand. His words were polished, practiced, full of buzzwords and flattery. He managed to make the toast largely about himself while still cloaking it in familial praise. Finally, Richard rose. The room hushed immediately. Attention gathered around him like gravity. He approached the podium with effortless confidence, commanding the space the way he always had, like oxygen in his lungs was a little more rarefied than everyone else's. Thank you for being here, he began, his voice filling every corner of the ornate dining hall. Looking around tonight, I see more than colleagues. I see fellow builders. Companions on a journey that spanned 40 years. I held my breath. Just a sentence. A nod. A sliver of inclusion, but as he continued, I could already feel the silence where my name should have been. He launched into stories of shifting markets, regulatory changes, financial upheavals, and corporate victories with the finesse of someone who'd spent his entire career turning confidence into capital. His delivery was smooth, charismatic, even magnetic. Everyone leaned in, captivated by the version of Richard Harrington that rarely surfaced outside professional settings. Even I felt pulled in, momentarily forgetting decades of cold indifference. Then, a pivot. None of this, he said, voice lowering a notch, would have been achievable without the strength of my late wife, Elaine. A breath caught in my throat. He never spoke of her, not at holidays, not on anniversaries, not even when I reached out on the day we lost her. And now, suddenly, in front of a sea of strangers, he brought her back into the light. She understood the demands of building something worthwhile, he said, his composure nearly cracking. She was my anchor when things were hard, my quiet reassurance when doubt crept in. I wish she were here to witness what her unwavering support helped create. Moisture welled in my eyes. This was the first time in years I'd seen even a flicker of vulnerability behind his immovable exterior. I wanted to believe this was a turning point, that age had softened the edges of a man who never allowed softness before guests dabbed at their eyes. I felt Scott's fingers brush against mine, a silent gesture of solidarity. Then came the shift. He cleared his throat, posture straightening. But what truly defines a life well lived isn't earnings or accolades, he said, his tone hardening into something ceremonial. It's legacy. What you leave behind. Who continues your vision? My chest tightened. I leaned forward instinctively. Was this it? The acknowledgement I'd waited for all my life. I consider myself fortunate. He went on, turning toward the central table, because I don't have to wonder if my principles will endure. I held my breath. Jason, he said, gesturing proudly, has outperformed every projection. Not only an asset manager, but an architect of financial innovation. The Reynolds acquisition? That alone would define most careers. For him, it's just another milestone. Jason inclined his head like royalty receiving a knighthood, and Kimberly, my father continued, eyes shining, is saving lives on a daily basis as one of Boston's top cardiac surgeons. Just last month, she executed a procedure so advanced. Medical journals are still discussing it. Discipline. Focus. Brilliance. She embodies the values I hold most dear. Kimberly smiled faintly, her diamond flashing as she tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. Then came the dagger. As I prepare to close this chapter, he said, lifting his glass, I find peace knowing that the ones who carry my name with honor, the ones who truly made me proud, are right here beside me. Applause thundered, heads turned. Smilifes. Toasts were raised toward Jason and Kimberly. I remained still, the breath knocked clean from my lungs. The ones who made me proud. As though I'd never existed. As if I were invisible, worse, expendable. But it wasn't over. As the clapping faded, his gaze swept across the room, and settled on me. Unblinking. Cold. You can leave. 3 words. Pronounced clearly. No ambiguity. At first, murmurs of confusion. Guests scanned the room, unsure who he meant. Until their eyes followed his line of sight, straight to me. Silence descended. Sharp. Stifling. I froze. The humiliation landed like a blow to the chest. This wasn't a subtle slight. This was exile. Declared under chandeliers and linen-covered tables, before dozens of colleagues, relatives, and strangers. My father had erased me in front of everyone. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. Her face paled in genuine disbelief. Kimberly didn't flinch, just examined her fingernails. Like this was a dull moment in a board meeting. Jason looked amused. The corners of his mouth curled as if he'd just heard a particularly biting joke. Time stalled. Heat flooded my face, every eye burning holes through my skin. I rose slowly, legs unsteady beneath me. The screech of my chair echoed across the space, louder than the quartet's strings. This wasn't just dismissal. It was erasure. A public branding. I'd fought so long, so hard, for something as basic as respect. And in one cruel moment, he confirmed what I'd long suspected. Nothing I did would ever be enough. I gripped the table for balance, my fingers aching from the pressure. My breath trembled, but I refused to let the tears fall. He would not see me break. Not here. Not now. And then, a sound interrupted the stillness. Another chair moved. Beside me, Scott stood, slowly, purposefully. I turned my head just enough to glimpse his face. Not shame. Not confusion. Rage. Quiet, steady fury. The room shifted again. Soft whispers rippled across the crowd. My father's jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck twitching. This wasn't part of his carefully choreographed night. Scott was supposed to remain neutral, forgettable. My husband had always been a footnote in my father's story, but now, he was writing his own. Sit down, my father ordered, addressing Scott directly for the first time all evening. His voice was clipped, sharp, laced with disbelief. This has nothing to do with you. But Scott didn't budge. Instead, he rose to his full height, shoulders back, chin high, his eyes locking with Richard Harrington's across the glittering banquet hall. The room tensed. Nobody dared move. The silence thickened until it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, and then, with calm defiance, Scott lifted his water glass in one hand, his fingers brushing against the stem, while the other held a spoon. A soft ping rang through the hall as metal touched crystal. Subtle, deliberate, unmistakable, the universal cue for attention. All eyes snapped toward US.My father's complexion darkened. This was supposed to be his ceremony. His narrative. His stage. And Scott had just challenged the script. What do you think you're doing? He growled, though the commanding tone he relied on had begun to falter. Scott didn't answer. He waited. Patient. Silent. Until every whisper, every breath, every murmured reaction faded into nothing. The crowd turned, expectant. He placed the spoon down carefully, steady hands revealing not nerves but resolve. Then, finally, he spoke. I'd like to raise a glass, Scott said, his voice cutting through the hush like a slow blade, to the woman Richard Harrington refused to see. A collective inhale swept across the room. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. Beside me, someone gasped, their wineglass paused halfway to their lips. A woman nearby whispered to her friend, he's really doing this. For those unfamiliar with me, Scott continued, I'm Scott Taylor, Amanda's husband. And since Richard has given you his version of family tonight, I'd like to share a few truths about the daughter he told to leave. My father stepped forward, his jaw taut. Enough. Security will remove you both. Scott turned slightly, unbothered. By all means, go ahead. But I wonder how the Boston Globe would cover the story of a retiring banking executive having his own daughter and son-in-law escorted out for daring to speak. The air shifted. My father stopped. His gaze flicked to the crowd, to his colleagues, his investors, his mentors, faces he'd spent decades impressing. Reputation had always been his currency. And now it was being leveraged against him. Scott pressed on. 3 years ago, Amanda launched Lighthouse Press with savings she scraped together, plus a small loan. No trust fund. No favors. Just her vision and determination. He paused, letting the words settle. Last year, her company released Salt and Stone, which was not only nominated for the Massachusetts Book Award, it was just picked up for a screen adaptation. Gasps echoed. My eyes widened. That was new information, even to me. He'd kept it quiet. He'd planned this. For me, she's built something meaningful, he went on. A platform for unheard voices, veterans, immigrants, survivors, writers, who'd been dismissed, overlooked, forgotten. Amanda gave them space. And their stories are changing lives. I felt like I was floating outside myself. His voice, the way it carried, the strength behind every word, it felt like watching someone read a love letter to my soul in front of a stunned audience. She created a literacy initiative that's distributed over 3,000 books to underfunded schools in this city. While Jason was climbing the finance ladder, and Kimberly was advancing in medicine, Amanda was beside her mother, reading poetry to her when she was too weak to hold a paperback. My breath caught. Those hours in the hospital came rushing back, Elaine's fragile hands, her fading voice, her smile when I read her favorite lines. And what Richard doesn't know, Scott added, now steady but firm, is that Jason's first Manhattan apartment? The deposit came from Amanda's college savings. When he was drowning in gambling debt, she helped him. Quietly. Without ever telling anyone. Even when he never said thank you. Jason's face lost all color. His hand twitched near his wineglass. That moment, years ago, had felt like a rare sliver of connection between us. I'd helped because he needed it. Because that's what siblings were supposed to do. I never imagined he'd sit silently as I was shamed in public. Scott looked directly at my father now. For over 3 decades, you've told Amanda she wasn't enough. Too soft. Too creative. Too unwilling to follow your blueprint. You withheld kindness. Used approval like a weapon. And tonight, you tried to reduce her to nothing in front of the very people who matter to you. He turned toward the room now, his words addressed not just to my father, but to everyone watching. But here's what truly defines family, he said, voice unwavering. It's not about performance. It's not measured by job titles or income brackets. Family doesn't tally love like bank statements. Real family chooses you. Believes in you. Stands by you when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. My father finally found his voice again, hoarse with fury. You have no place saying any of this. You don't understand our family. Scott's reply came without hesitation. I understand plenty. I understand that a man who casts out his daughter in front of an audience isn't celebrating his legacy. He's exposing its emptiness. The stillness inside that lavish banquet hall was so complete, I could hear ice clinking softly in untouched glasses. No one dared shift in their chairs. Breathing felt suspended. The air itself held its breath. Then Scott turned toward me, his gaze softened. no anger now, only fierce devotion and something deeper. Amanda is the bravest soul I've ever known, he said evenly. Not because she fulfilled someone else's blueprint for success, but because she withstood everything thrown at her and became herself anyway. He raised his glass once more, steady, unshaken, and for that, he continued, eyes meeting my father's again, thank you, Richard Harrington, for showing us the kind of parent we'll never become. He set his glass down, then he reached for my hand. The simple contact, his fingers wrapped around mine, grounded me as the full weight of what had just happened began to settle. The glittering chandeliers, the watchful stares, the still silence, they all felt miles away. We turned toward the exit, our footsteps rang against the polished marble, each one echoing like punctuation in a story that had just changed chapters. No one followed. No one intervened. The entire room held its breath as we moved past velvet chairs and expensive heels and unsipped flutes. Just before we reached the heavy doors, his voice rang out again, if you leave now, don't bother coming back. My father called, volume rising with desperation. You're cut off. You hear me? Both of you. His threats landed behind us like rocks in water, loud, but sinking fast. We didn't turn. We didn't respond. Scott's grip never loosened. As we passed the final table, I caught the eye of a man in his 70s, an old colleague of my father's, someone who'd been at every holiday party and business dinner growing up. He didn't speak. He just gave me a slight nod, subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, someone from my father's circle had acknowledged me not as an embarrassment, but as a person worthy of respect. The doors swung shut behind us, conversation erupted inside, muffled now, a contained storm we no longer had to weather. Outside, the cool night air hit my skin like a baptism. I inhaled deeply, the first real breath I'd taken all night. It smelled of fresh rain and spring blossoms and liberation. Scott opened the passenger door and neither of us said anything as he got in and started the car. The Hawthorne's ornate lights shrank behind us in the rearview mirror, fading like the memory of a long, exhausting dream. Are you all right? He finally asked, voice quiet as the engine hummed. I wasn't. Not fully. Something had cracked open inside me, years of trying, of pretending, of carrying weight that was never mine. I felt hollow and full all at once. I don't know, I admitted. But maybe I will be. He reached for my hand again. We drove in silence. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Leaving behind judgment, expectation, and the burden of constantly needing to prove my worth. When we got home, the collapse happened instantly. I barely made it to the couch before the sobs came, loud, violent, uncontrollable. Grief, shame, fury, sorrow. All of it spilled out like floodwaters breaching a dam. Scott didn't speak. He held me tightly, letting my tears soak his shirt. His arms wrapped around my shaking body like a shield. I'm sorry, I choked out. I'm so sorry you had to do that. I'm not, he said firmly. I've been waiting to say those things for 3 years. He'll never forgive us, I whispered. More tears followed, some part of me, no matter how small, still clinging to the impossible dream of being accepted. Scott didn't flinch. That's his failure, he said gently. And frankly, Amanda, his forgiveness doesn't mean a damn thing. We stayed up talking into the early hours. The initial shock slowly gave way to something more complex, rage at his cruelty, grief for the connection that never was, dread over what fallout might come next, but beneath it all, there was also a strange new feeling, relief. A sense that something long dormant had been released. Just before dawn, while brushing his teeth, Scott looked at me through the mirror. Did I go too far? He asked, the first flicker of uncertainty touching his voice. You defended me, I said, when no one ever has. Not even me. Sleep was fractured. My phone lit up over and over again. 7 missed calls. Each voicemail more hostile than the last. My father's voice, escalating, from outrage to threats to guilt-laced demands for apologies. I didn't listen past the first few seconds. I let them pile up, the screen glowing beside our bed like distant flashes of lightning. At 9:48 a.m. I received a text from Kimberly. You always make everything about you. It was his night. You and Scott ruined it, like always. I stared at the message, stunned not by the content, but by her complete disconnect from what had happened. In her mind, I was the antagonist. The selfish one. Not the daughter exiled in front of a crowd, but at 10:17 a.m., something unexpected happened. Jason called. My first instinct was to ignore it, expecting more blame. But something told me to answer. That was something, he said after a long pause. His tone unreadable. I didn't plan any of it, I said cautiously. I know. Another pause. Was it true? What Scott said about the apartment money? Yes. A longer silence. Why didn't you ever throw that back at me? Especially after I was such an ass. Because that's not why I did it. The quiet stretched. Again. And then, his voice, softer than I'd heard in years. I never thanked you. I should have. It doesn't matter. Maybe it does. He cleared his throat. Look, what Dad did last night, that wasn't okay. I've never seen him like that. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. A tiny crack in the wall between us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't standing alone. After ending the call with Jason, I sat still, the phone cradled in my palm, uncertain how to process the subtle shift in our dynamic. The unexpected softness in his voice echoed long after the line had gone dead. By Monday morning, I dragged myself into the office, trying to mask the emotional wreckage with makeup and caffeine. My supervisor, Marion, took one look at my face and quietly ushered me into her office. You look like you've just returned from battle, she said, pouring steaming coffee into a ceramic mug. What on earth happened? I gave her the edited version, stripped of names but laced with emotional truth. Without missing a beat, she responded, take the week. We'll handle Hopkins without you. I can't just drop everything because my family imploded, I protested, gripping the coffee like a lifeline. She sat across from me, her tone gentle but unwavering. If you fractured your leg, you'd take time off. What happened to you isn't visible, but it's just as real. Something inside you is damaged, Amanda. And it deserves the same space to mend. Reluctantly, I agreed to a few days away from work. What followed was a fog of emotional exhaustion. I alternated between endless tears and mindless hours in front of streaming shows I barely registered. Scott stayed nearby, working remotely from the living room, offering companionship without intrusion. Life outside our apartment continued as if nothing had changed. Inside, I felt like the world had cracked open. By Thursday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Aunt Patricia standing there, clutching a large envelope and looking uncharacteristically uncertain. May I come in? She asked, her voice unsteady. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She sat stiffly on the edge of our couch, refusing coffee or tea. What my brother did was inexcusable, she began, skipping pleasantries. I should have spoken up that night. I didn't. I've spent years justifying his cruelty, telling myself he was simply particular. But I was wrong. She handed me the envelope. Inside were aged photographs I'd never seen before. My mother glowing with pregnancy. Me as a toddler perched on my father's shoulders, both of us laughing. One snapshot showed him patiently guiding my hands as I held a fishing rod during a family trip. Patricia's voice softened. He wasn't always like this. After Elaine's first diagnosis, something inside him shifted. He became obsessed with structure, control, believing that order could keep tragedy from returning. But it consumed him. And it consumed his love. I studied the images, tiny windows into a version of my father I'd never known. Gentle. Present. Affectionate. It doesn't excuse what he's done, I said quietly. No, she agreed. But I wanted you to know that, once, he loved you without condition. That ability didn't vanish. It just got buried under years of fear. After she left, I tucked the envelope into a drawer. I couldn't keep looking at those photos. But I couldn't discard them either. The chaos of that dinner rippled through the family grapevine. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, curious, concerned, shocked. A cousin from Chicago texted to say she always suspected my father treated me unfairly. One of his in-laws called to share she'd long thought Richard was too hard on me. The stories were unraveling. The myth of our picture-perfect family was being rewritten. 5 days after that night, his name flashing on my screen triggered a panic so intense I couldn't breathe. Scott sat beside me on the floor, guiding me through grounding exercises. Until the dizziness passed, that evening, he handed me a list of therapists. You need someone trained to help unpack this, he said gently. This is more than I can guide you through alone. I scanned the list, stopping at a profile of Dr. Eleanor Waters. Her firm expression and kind eyes radiated calm. I scheduled the appointment for Tuesday. What if this shatters me? I whispered. That night as we got ready for bed. What if I learn I'm even more broken than I realized? Scott pulled me into his arms. You're not broken. You're hurting. There's a difference. Sometimes, we need to crack open to finally start mending. Exactly 1 week after that public unraveling, our doorman called from downstairs. Mr. Richard Harrington is here. Should I let him up? My hands trembled. I looked at Scott, whose expression was steady. It's your decision, he said. I inhaled deeply. Let's finish this. When my father walked into our apartment, he seemed smaller, his usual aura of command dimmed. He scanned the room with thinly veiled disapproval, clearly unimpressed by our cozy but modest living space. I came to clear the air, he announced. No greeting. No apology. You humiliated me in front of everyone, he continued, voice tight. That spectacle at the restaurant, your husband ruined my evening. You told me to leave, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. What did you think would happen? I expected you to respect my wishes, he snapped. Instead, your partner made a scene that tarnished everything I've built. Scott remained beside me, silent, letting me lead the confrontation. Did you come here to say you're sorry? I asked. He blinked, genuinely confused. Sorry? For what? For being honest about how disappointing you've been. I stared at him, finally seeing the truth Scott had been trying to show me for years. He wasn't angry because I failed. He was angry because I refused to become someone I wasn't. I think you should leave. I'm not finished, he barked. I've spoken with my lawyer. Unless you and your husband issue a formal apology, you'll be excluded from my estate. Understood? The old version of me would have begged for mercy, eager to reclaim even a sliver of validation, but that version no longer lived here. We never wanted your inheritance, I said, voice calm. What we wanted was acceptance. But I'm done begging for what should have always been given freely. His expression hardened. You'll regret this. When you're broke, drowning in your vanity project, you'll wish you had been more grateful. I respect myself now, I replied. And that's worth more than anything in your will. He turned abruptly and stormed out, slamming the door behind him so forcefully that a photo on the wall crashed to the floor. I knelt to pick it up. It was a snapshot from our wedding, Scott and I laughing, cake smeared across our faces. The frame had cracked. As I removed the shattered glass, I murmured, how fitting. What is? Scott asked, looking over. The only thing that broke was the frame. We were still whole. Scott helped me gather the broken glass, sweeping the last jagged pieces into a dustpan without saying a word. Neither of us mentioned my father again that evening. Instead, we ordered Thai from our favorite local spot, opened a bottle of Pinot Noir, and sat on the couch debating whether Portland might offer the fresh beginning we both craved. The concept of relocation, of aligning physical boundaries with emotional truth, felt more and more like the right answer. A new zip code. A different skyline. A city untouched by old wounds. That night, as I drifted off to sleep beside Scott, one realization struck me gently. I hadn't apologized for anything all day. Not once. For someone who had spent decades reflexively offering sorrow just for existing, it felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of myself. My first appointment with Dr. Eleanor Waters began simply. She greeted me with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that exuded quiet strength. Tell me about your father, she said, her tone soft but direct, and just like that, words poured out of me, stories I had never fully voiced, not even to Scott. Details I thought I had forgotten. Moments I thought were too small to matter. Eleanor listened without interrupting, occasionally scribbling notes, her expression never changing. At the end of the session, she looked at me with gentle curiosity. Amanda, have you ever considered that what you experienced might be emotional abuse? The question settled over me like mist, quiet, undeniable. That simple sentence marked the beginning of a 3-month transformation. We peeled back years of unhealthy patterns, dissected coping mechanisms I had mistaken for personality traits, and gently unraveled the threads of generational dysfunction that had wrapped themselves around my sense of identity. Recovery isn't linear, Dr. Waters warned. There will be setbacks. Old scripts may feel more believable than new ones. That's part of the process. She was right. Some mornings I woke up certain I was broken beyond repair. On others, a minor critique at work sent me spiraling into self-doubt. There were still moments when I found myself staring at my phone, hoping to see my father's name. Even after everything, panic didn't vanish overnight either. Episodes would strike randomly, sometimes sparked by a specific trigger, sometimes out of nowhere. After a particularly intense one left me curled on the floor of our kitchen, Dr. Waters gently brought up the idea of short-term medication. This isn't forever, she assured me. Think of it as scaffolding. Something to support you while your body learns it's safe. The low-dose prescription helped. Within weeks, I noticed the difference. The constant undercurrent of dread quieted. Sleep became easier. I found myself laughing more, freely, not politely. I started contributing in meetings again. Scott noticed too. Meanwhile, Portland stopped being just a fantasy and started becoming a plan. We researched with focus, building spreadsheets comparing walkability, cost of living, and literary community events. The city's progressive values, lush landscapes, and publishing-friendly atmosphere seemed perfectly aligned with where I wanted my life to go. Are we escaping? I asked Scott late one evening, laptop open to a list of available rentals. We're moving toward something better, he replied. That's not the same thing. The decision crystallized when Scott received a surprising email. A Portland-based tech company specializing in publishing tools had offered him a role, with a generous salary increase and flexible scheduling. 3 remote days per week. It's like the universe is giving us permission, he said, holding up his phone with a smile. We set a 6-month timeline. Long enough to close out projects, wrap up loose ends, and ensure Lighthouse Press transitioned smoothly. I was explaining our relocation plans to Marion one afternoon when her gaze shifted over my shoulder. Amanda Taylor, came a voice laced with confidence and high-end perfume. I turned to see a woman approaching in designer heels, dressed impeccably, carrying herself like someone who'd never been interrupted. I'm Vivian Newell, she said. I worked as your father's executive assistant for 15 years. My stomach turned. If this is about, she cut me off with a raised hand. He has no idea I'm here. I retired last month, so he can't fire me. May I have a moment of your time? We walked to a nearby cafe. Vivian waited until we were seated before speaking. I watched him destroy people, she said, stirring her coffee slowly. He cut down junior associates in front of clients, rewrote others' work and claimed credit, iced out anyone who disagreed. But he saved his worst for you. My breath caught. I always assumed he was harder on family, I muttered. No, she said, her expression firm. He's hardest on people who threaten his control. That includes capable women. That includes you. She paused, scanning my face. 3 of his peers came to me after that dinner. Separately. Each one said the same thing. They always thought Richard treated you unfairly. But your husband's speech? It gave people language for something they'd witnessed but never named. I looked at her. Why are you telling me this now? Vivian took a long sip, then set her cup down. Her voice dropped to something nearly intimate. Because for years, I watched you twist yourself into someone you weren't, trying to meet a man at a finish line he kept moving. I watched you carry shame that wasn't yours. And I kept quiet. That silence ends today. She reached across the table, placing her hand lightly on mine. You were never the problem, Amanda. He was. That conversation with Vivian was unexpected and affirming. Hearing someone outside my immediate circle acknowledge what I'd endured provided the kind of clarity I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time, I knew it hadn't been in my head. I hadn't been dramatic or overly sensitive. I'd simply been surviving an environment built on shifting expectations and silent punishment. That knowledge became fuel. I started reaching out to relatives from my mother's side, people I'd gradually lost contact with after her passing. To my surprise, they welcomed the reconnection. Messages turned into phone calls. Phone calls became invitations. One weekend, Scott and I traveled to Connecticut to visit my mother's sister, Judith. She welcomed us into her cozy home with open arms and vintage photo albums. Over tea, she handed me a journal your mom kept. This in college, Aunt Judith said, passing me the leather-bound notebook. She was an artist, you know, before Richard encouraged her to be more practical. Flipping through the pages, I saw delicate ink sketches and lyrical poetry, vibrant with passion and introspection. For years, I'd assumed my creativity was some genetic fluke in a family of pragmatists. Discovering it was actually part of my maternal legacy felt like recovering something sacred. She looked at me with soft eyes. She would be so proud of you. Those words stayed with me. A few months later, I stood behind a podium at a literary gathering, delivering a speech about Lighthouse Press and its mission to amplify marginalized voices. Halfway through, I paused, only to realize I hadn't mentally second-guessed a single sentence. No censoring. No imagined voice of disapproval in my head. You were brilliant, Scott told me afterward, smiling as we clinked glasses with fellow writers. I didn't picture his face once, I said, astonished. Not even when I mispronounced that author's name. During my next appointment, Dr. Waters smiled. That's called progress, she said. It means your internal critic is being replaced by your own voice, one that actually supports you. Our move to Portland gained momentum. A weekend scouting trip led us to a craftsman-style bungalow with a converted garage, ideal for a home office. We placed a deposit immediately. It felt like breathing room, literally and emotionally. Back in Boston, I expanded Lighthouse's scope. We launched a new imprint dedicated to memoirs exploring emotional healing, generational trauma, and redefined family bonds. It was both personally significant and professionally satisfying, a bridge between advocacy and art. My bond with Jason continued its slow rebuild. He called occasionally, and the conversations began to shed their surface-level polish. One afternoon, his tone shifted. I've been seeing someone, he admitted, a therapist, he clarified quickly. That night forced me to confront some truths. Like how much time I've spent chasing approval I'll never get. It's exhausting. It was the most honest thing I'd heard him say since childhood. Kimberly, meanwhile, stayed aligned with our father. Her wedding invitation arrived addressed solely to Scott. Inside was a note, please, no drama. We declined with a standard RSVP card and a generous gift from the registry. 6 months after that night, Scott and I found ourselves talking about parenthood. It was a topic I'd always sidestepped, terrified that I would repeat the patterns I grew up under. What if I turn into him? I whispered. What if I can't give a child the love I never had? Scott took my hands. The fact that you're asking that question means you won't, he said. You're conscious. You're healing. That makes all the difference. That night, I sat across from Dr. Waters and did something I'd never dared before. I allowed myself to feel the full scope of my fury. No filters. No rationalizations. I hate what he did to me, I said, the words like glass shattering. I hate that I spent years trying to be someone he could love. I hate that even now, a part of me still hopes for his approval. She listened without flinching. Then handed me a blank sheet of paper. Write it, she said. Everything you've never said. And don't hold back. So I did. The letter that followed was raw, brutal, and unsparing. I wrote until my hand cramped, pressing so hard at times the pen tore the page. When I finished, I didn't feel broken, I felt lighter. The anger had somewhere to go. Later that week, I noticed something strange that I hadn't thought about him every day. The tightrope of needing validation had loosened. His silence didn't crush me anymore, it simply existed. No longer a wound. Just distance. As we boxed up our lives in Boston, preparing for the cross-country move, an unexpected email arrived. It was from the elderly gentleman who'd nodded to me the night we exited the retirement dinner. I'll be relocating to Portland next month, he wrote. Richard and I had a falling out recently. His treatment of a young analyst mirrored how I saw him treat you. If you and Scott are open to it, I'd love to meet once you're settled. Sometimes, the families we choose matter more than the ones we're born into. It was simple, but profound. While packing, I stumbled across the manila envelope Aunt Patricia had given me months ago. This time, when I opened it, my chest didn't tighten. The photos felt less like open wounds and more like distant chapters. I tucked them beside newer memories, pictures of Scott and me hiking in the White Mountains, holding hands on a windswept trail. The contrast said everything. One life was ending. Another had already begun. Our table at the book festival overflowed with visitors, curious readers drawn in by our mission and stories. Later that evening, a dinner with close companions filled our small apartment with laughter, the kind that makes you feel truly seen. Not for how well you perform, but for who you genuinely are. On our final evening in Boston, the rooms were bare, the echoes of the past still lingering in corners. I stood at the window, gazing over the skyline as the city shimmered in twilight. Second thoughts? Scott asked, slipping his arms around my waist. I leaned back into him, shaking my head. Not doubts, just farewells. Saying goodbye to the version of me that lived here. The one always chasing validation. She was always enough, he said softly. She just hadn't figured that out yet. The following morning, as we drove west, I noticed something curious. I hadn't checked for voicemails from my father in days. Not out of resistance, simply because the urge had vanished. The ache for recognition had evolved into something sturdier. Not the absence of sadness, but the presence of dignity. Portland greeted us with golden light and unexpected warmth, almost as if the universe had been holding its breath, waiting to exhale. As we unpacked in our new place, I came across the wedding photo from the night of my father's final ultimatum. The shattered glass had been replaced. The frame remained. This should go here, I told Scott, placing it gently above the fireplace. He nodded. A reminder of where we came from, and the weight we chose not to carry. 1 year after the explosion that changed everything, I stood in our sunlit kitchen with a chilled glass of sparkling cider. Outside, Scott stood at the grill, surrounded by new friends who had quickly become our family by choice. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the fence, their petals dancing through the spring air like tiny flags of rebirth. So much had changed since that awful night in Boston. Lighthouse Press had found its footing, even thriving, within Portland's welcoming creative ecosystem. We'd won recognition for community outreach and storytelling workshops, especially those geared toward trauma recovery. Therapy had shifted from urgent weekly sessions to monthly check-ins, still important, but no longer a lifeline, and most life-altering of all, I was 4 months pregnant. You need help with anything? Aunt Patricia asked, balancing a platter as she entered the kitchen. Her continued closeness had caused a lasting rift with my father, but she no longer let that dictate her decisions. At 68, she'd chosen principle over appeasement. I'm good, I replied, handing her a tray of small bites. Just finish up outside. While arranging cheese and fruit, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Jason, suitcase in hand, looking travel-weary but sincere. Sorry I'm late, he said. The flight was a mess. I hugged him, still adjusting to the evolution in our relationship. We'd moved from stiff phone calls to real conversations. He'd visited Portland before, each time peeling away another layer of guardedness. Come in. Everyone's out back. How's Claire? I asked, thinking of the woman he'd started seeing, an elementary teacher with a calm, grounding presence. She's great, he said. Wanted to come, but couldn't swing the time off. He hesitated, then handed me an envelope. I've been torn about this. But, you should see it. Inside was a short clipping from a Boston business publication. My father's face appeared. Smaller than I remembered, beneath the headline, Former First Atlantic EVP hospitalized following mild stroke. He's okay physically, Jason assured me. But it shook him. He's mostly alone now. Kimberly drops in when she can, but she's knee-deep in residency hours. He wouldn't hire any help at first, Jason continued. Tried cooking. And ended up triggering the smoke alarm. A neighbor called me. I stared at the photo. The man who had loomed so large in my life, so critical, so commanding, now looked unfamiliar. Frail. Human. I'm sorry he's unwell, I said, and I meant it. But I'm not sure what you want me to do with this. Jason lifted a shoulder. Nothing, maybe. I just thought you deserved to know. I laid the article on the counter. I'd give myself space to feel whatever surfaced, but not today. Today was about growth, about joy, about what we were building. The celebration around me felt like a living thing. Authors from our publishing circle chatted with software engineers. Patricia offered gardening tips to the neighbor next door. The afternoon shimmered with laughter and shared stories. Jason slowly eased into the rhythm of things, nodding along as one of our memoirists spoke about narrative therapy and identity reclamation. It was the first time I'd seen my brother look not just present, but engaged. As I stood in the middle of that backyard, belly rounding beneath my sundress, I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. A chapter was closing, not with finality, but with grace, and something new was just beginning. As dusk settled and laughter lingered in the air, Scott tapped his glass, commanding the room's attention. Conversations hushed. Faces turned toward him, expectant. A year ago, he began, voice warm but deliberate. Amanda and I made one of the boldest choices of our lives, starting fresh here in Portland. But the real turning point happened long before the moving boxes. It started with a dinner neither of us will ever forget. Several guests exchanged subtle nods, their expressions knowing that evening could have crushed us. He continued, pausing briefly. Instead, it became our turning point. The catalyst for freedom. He turned to me, eyes glowing with quiet pride, to Amanda, whose resilience redefined what strength looks like, not the absence of struggle, but the courage to rise, again and again. He raised his drink higher. And to each of you, our chosen tribe, thank you for embracing us without conditions. The room erupted in cheers, glasses lifted in unison. The moment shimmered with sincerity, a celebration not just of geography but transformation. Wrapped in the warmth of genuine connection, I experienced a peace I'd spent years chasing. What I once thought would come from paternal approval had always been out of reach. That illusion had finally dissolved. Belonging, I had discovered, didn't require distortion, it asked for authenticity. Once the final guest departed, Jason lingered behind, sleeves rolled up, loading dishes with an ease I'd never seen in him before. I've got a confession, he said, drying a mug with surprising focus. I've been in therapy for 8 months. My face lit up. Jason, that's amazing. It shifted everything, Dad, me, even you, he admitted. Then, leaning against the counter, his tone grew quieter. Did you ever know I envied you as kids? The glass nearly slipped from my fingers. You? Envious of me? You were always the golden one. I wasn't. I was the compliant one, he clarified. I followed Dad's blueprint to the letter. Earned his nods. But you, he paused. You had something I didn't. You knew who you were, even when it meant losing his favor. Emotion tightened my throat. We spoke for hours after Scott headed to bed, revisiting childhood memories through a lens neither of us had accessed before. When Jason finally stood to leave, he pulled me into a long embrace. I regret not being a better brother, he murmured. We're rewriting the script, I reminded him. This chapter matters more. 3 days later, while browsing Powell's, my phone vibrated. A text from Kimberly, the first in ages. Dad asking about you. Probably not important. Just thought I should say, frozen between 2 aisles, I instinctively placed a hand over the soft swell beneath my shirt. The former version of me would have dropped everything, sprinted across the country, hoping for reconciliation. But that girl had faded. Now, I recognized Kimberly's message for what it was, a subtle shift of responsibility. A passive prompt disguised as concern. A way to absolve him of accountability. Later, after a quiet conversation with Scott over tea, I composed a reply, thank you for updating me. I wish him well. No door slammed. No desperate leaps. Just a simple recognition of shared humanity, detached from history's weight. 2 weeks passed, while visiting a friend recovering from minor surgery, I turned a hospital corner and nearly collided with a familiar frame. My father. Thinner. Slower. One corner of his mouth subtly sagged, a silent marker of the stroke Jason had described. His expression flickered between recognition and guardedness. Amanda, he said, voice more gravel than I remembered. Hi, Dad, I replied, calm washing over me like a tide. Jason mentioned you weren't feeling well. I hope things are improving. He nodded slowly. Routine stuff. Nothing major. We stood in awkward silence, nurses and visitors flowing around us like a current diverted by two unmoved stones. You seem different, he finally observed. A smile touched my lips. I'm expecting. Due in November. His features shifted, eyes widening, jaw tightening ever so slightly. A glimpse of something unspoken passed across his face, grief, maybe. Or remorse. It vanished quickly. I see. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied, voice steady, even as another long pause stretched between us. Time seemed to hold its breath. I caught myself waiting, perhaps for remorse, some glimmer of accountability, a phrase that might ease years of ache. But his face remained unreadable, posture firm, emotion buried deep. I should go, I said softly. My friend's expecting me. He inclined his head. Send Scott my regards. The normalcy of that sentence, so at odds with our history, almost made me laugh. I didn't. I gave a small nod and walked past him, continuing down the corridor without looking back. What stayed with me afterward wasn't his presence, but my own response. No racing pulse. No shrinking sense of self. No desperate impulse to earn affection. I had faced him, unshielded, and remained whole. That night, lying beside Scott, I whispered what had settled inside me. He won't change. Not in any real way. Scott didn't hesitate. Probably not. Are you alright with that? I took a long breath, then answered with certainty. Yes. I finally know his limits were never my fault. As autumn painted Portland in shades of fire and gold, we turned our focus inward, baby furniture, tiny onesies, jars of paint for the nursery. Jason came twice, each time arriving with oversized packages and jokes that barely masked his excitement. Aunt Patricia mailed handmade quilts, along with updates about distant relatives and the occasional piece of news about my father. He's been spending time with a woman from his congregation, she said during one call. Widowed. Kind. Surprisingly tolerant. Good, I replied, and I meant it. His happiness, or lack thereof, no longer dictated mine. In late November, after a long labor, Lily Eleanor Taylor entered the world. The first time I held her, something in me cracked wide open. Fierce, unwavering love surged through every inch of me. She's perfect, Scott whispered, brushing her tiny hand, staring at her peaceful expression. I made a vow. She would never feel she had to earn love. She would know, without question, that she mattered. No performance, no pleasing, no bending to another's image. Just her, entirely enough. Jason flew in the following week. He held her awkwardly at first, arms stiff with fear and awe. She's got mom's eyes, he murmured, lightly touching her cheek. I thought so too, I smiled, warmed by the recognition. After a pause, he added, I told Dad about her. He didn't say much. Just asked to see a picture. I nodded, unmoved. The man who once cast such a long shadow now barely touched the edges of my world. As December crept in, we hosted a small gathering, our own version of family. Jason and Claire. Patricia with her contagious laugh. Colleagues who had become confidants. Friends who knew our story and stayed anyway. Lily passed from one embrace to the next, her presence tying us all together. The house buzzed with kindness and belonging. After dinner, dessert in hand, Scott stood to speak. To family, he said. Not only the one we're born into, but the one we choose, nurture, and grow. To family, came the chorus, glasses raised, eyes shining. I looked around. No one in this room demanded that I shrink. Every person here had seen me, truly seen me, and loved me still. That disastrous dinner so long ago, once a breaking point, now felt like the beginning of everything. Real. The night I rose and walked away wasn't a collapse. It was the first step toward everything that followed. Later, as Lily stirred, I slipped into the nursery. The rocker creaked softly beneath me as I nursed her beneath moonlight and dreams. You never have to prove you deserve love, I whispered, cradling her tiny body. It's already yours. Always will be. In that moment, I realized, finally, I had given myself the same gift. Acceptance not tied to accolades. Peace not bought with approval. The path hadn't been easy. But I had walked it anyway. Through every step, I discovered what my father never understood. I was whole. I had always been whole. Laughter drifted down the hallway. Lily's small fingers wrapped tightly around mine. This was legacy. Not his disappointment. Not inherited shame. But this living, breathing hope. A life built not from someone else's blueprint, but from courage, choice, and truth. What about you? Have you ever broken free from the weight of someone else's expectations? Has anyone ever stood beside you when you couldn't stand on your own? Share your story in the comments below, and if this journey moved you, please subscribe and send this video to someone who needs to hear they're already enough, exactly as they are. Thank you for walking this road with me. Remember, sometimes healing begins the moment you stop chasing those who never knew how to hold you.